Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Hello and welcome back to the show. My guest today is again Joe Langley. This is the second part of our 2-hour conversation. Part 1, in case you missed it, was published the week before in episode number 73. So please make sure you listen to that as well. Otherwise, you miss the foundation for what we discuss in this second part. We still talk about high-speed rail in Australia, and maybe without big surprise, I am asking the question about the possibility of using a different technology other than rail. So be curious what this is and what comes out of it, and please enjoy. This podcast is not sponsored by third parties, which means uninterrupted listening to the episodes for you, and I hope you appreciate and enjoy that. If you want to support the show to keep it going, there are 2 ways you can do it. One is the typical request for podcast: subscribe and share with your friends. The other one is specific to the show and myself. I host a training portal with arguably the world's most comprehensive course offer on digital signaling technologies and everything to do with high capacity. Some of my trainings are one of a kind, which means unique in the world. For example, the High Capacity Signaling Blueprint, the High Capacity Railway Mindset Training, or most recently, my course about digital signaling interoperability. All of those courses are online, so you can watch the lessons at times convenient for you and as often as you like. And there is an industry-leading Q&A support where I will answer your questions not just during your training, but at least for further 12 months after you completed your course. What you can do that would be really nice is checking out this training portal, which you find at docfranktraining.podia.com. That is docfranktraining.podia.com. And if you find that you or a coworker of you can benefit from any of those courses, I would be very happy to see you growing your knowledge, understanding, and confidence through any of my trainings. Thank you. But now, please do enjoy this episode.
There needs to be not just walking the walk, but also talking the talk about making this a national strategy and not one that's driven by the states.
Yeah, right. But it needs to start somewhere, right? And I mean, the Sydney-Newcastle priority doesn't come from the New South Wales state government. It does come from the High Speed Rail Authority and hence from the federal government. So, and that's why I would
disagree with that. I would disagree with that because if you look at the 2013 study, the Sydney to Newcastle was actually the third phase. The second phase was the first and the second phase was Sydney to Canberra for many of the reasons that we've already discussed. There is a slight patronage benefit for the Sydney to Newcastle line. That is true. That's my understanding as well. But and not just because I live in the Southern Highlands, but because I've looked at the evidence. One of the greatest growth areas is actually to the south, within commuting distance of Sydney. It happens to be in the Southern Highlands. So the idea of this project going from Sydney to Newcastle was the mandate that was put in by the Albanese government. It didn't come out of the previous work they've done, which again is frustrating, and it undermines the whole scheme because we need to take a national perspective on this thing and decide what that phasing should be. So I honestly, I've got my guesses, but I don't think that the Sydney to Newcastle was on the basis of previous work that was done.
I have a guess as well, and I'm just volunteering it here for entertainment purposes. I would have thought if the new high-speed rail authority would have started with Sydney to Canberra, everybody would have called the federal government selfish, because the connection to Canberra, where the federal government sits, would have the first piece of high-speed rail. So if they don't want to appear selfish, then they may just go for a different connection, which could be Sydney to Newcastle, which is definitely in the top 3 of potential candidates for the first stage. And as I said before, you've got to start somewhere, right? So no matter what your grand plan is and your settlement strategy, somewhere needs to be the first stage that you built.
So I go back to my brain surgery example. Where would you want to cut your teeth on something as complex as high-speed rail? That's not the key decision point, but I think it is something that needs to be considered.
But
do you necessarily want to start out with the highest risk, the most complex, and the most expensive segment to start with?
Let me turn this around. So firstly, let's start with the business case argument. I still think national priority and long-term strategy backwards and forwards. I mean, as long as we don't have a settlement plan, we don't have anything like that, right? So the only strategy that we currently have at the moment is the vision of a high-speed rail connection that starts in Melbourne. Well, it doesn't start from a time perspective, but the line will probably start in Melbourne, not go much behind that. From Melbourne to Sydney, via Sydney to Brisbane. So that's the current vision. And then in the middle, you've got places like Canberra and Newcastle and the Gold Coast and what have you. So that's the current vision. So if you look at this vision, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and you are going via Newcastle. So Sydney to Brisbane will go via Newcastle. Everything else wouldn't make any sense. So why not starting with the most difficult pieces of track if that delivers a positive business case? I actually think it's very clever from the High Speed Rail Authority to start with the business case for a section of that future high speed rail vision, which has the most likelihood to actually make sense from a patronage viewpoint. Building a high speed rail that nobody's using is insanity. Yeah. And not having a strategy where you said, okay, well, maybe we're not using it today, but we will be using it in 5 years from now. And here are all the necessary steps that we are working on in order to make it usable in 5 years. That doesn't exist. So looking from the existing settlement plans, Sydney to Newcastle has I think, the highest likelihood of making sense from a patronage perspective. And you need the patronage because that's the only income that you have. Well, not the only income. We talk about value capture in a moment. But you've got to recover your investment cost from patronage to an extent. If you build a high-speed line that nobody's using, what's the point in this? So Sydney Newcastle makes sense from a business case patronage perspective. I personally think so. You may disagree with that, but I think it makes more sense from a patronage perspective than Sydney to the Southern Highlands. And you may agree with me on that one. So if I have that vision of going from Melbourne via Canberra, via Sydney, via Newcastle, via Gold Coast to Brisbane, I have certain challenges on that corridor. One challenge is we need to build tunnels. One challenge is we need to build viaducts. One challenge is we need to cut through some hills that are not that big that we need to build tunnels. So all of those challenges are there anyway. Do we know how to tunnel? Yes. If we don't, go and look to Sydney at Sydney Metro. They tell you how to tunnel. Melbourne, by the way, is tunneling as well. They know how to do it on their side. Brisbane is just building a tunnel underneath Brisbane River, so they know how that works. So if you need to tunnel anyway, I mean, and we do have capabilities of tunneling in Australia or companies who can do that, why is it such a big issue for Sydney to Newcastle? If I need to build tunnels anyway, why not starting with that? The only argument that's left, and I'll let you talk to that in a moment, the only argument that's left in my viewpoint is that the cost per kilometer is definitely higher between Sydney and Newcastle than the average between Melbourne and Brisbane. That's without question. But it doesn't have to be a bad thing as long as the business case stacks up.
Well, you could be right. I haven't seen the business case, and I haven't seen the basis for the business case, which you need a settlement strategy to be able to understand. So you start out by saying that the business case should support that. You could be right. But if you're looking at patronage and you're looking at costs, then if you have to build 60 kilometers of tunnel going one way, and you don't have to build anywhere near that going the other way, then your business case is probably going to be more positive by going south, I would guess. But I don't know. You could be right, Doc Frank. Because we have started out with an assumption that that's the right way to go, rather than with the evidence that would arrive from a national settlement strategy that showed you the sequencing. So I go back to the argument, what's the first thing you do? It's decide your strategy. If Newcastle came out as the first strategy for that from that standpoint, then let's go for it.
I would like to stay there with the discussion for a moment. And because I have questions around this whole decision-making process for this entire program, for this entire high-speed program in Australia. I just call it program because, or you call it high-speed initiative or whatever. I brought up previously the question around technology, and this is in fact how you and I got in touch. You listened to a previous high-speed event that I did also on the podcast here, the live event with Steve Alday, which I then turned into 2 podcast episodes. And in one of the episodes, I talked about Hyperloop as a placeholder of alternative technologies to rail. And the reason for that is not just to have some clickbait or being stupid out in the public. The rationale behind it was that I believe there is a maximum ceiling speed achievable with high-speed rail as a technology, metal wheels on metal rail. I don't see a long-term prospect of high-speed rail anywhere in the world, not just Australia, anywhere in the world, to achieve travel speeds, maximum travel speeds of more than 400 kilometers per hour in a way that your rails still remain maintainable and all this kind of stuff. There are other technologies out there. One would be maglev, magnetic levitation, which I guess probably has ceiling speeds of closer to 600 compared to 400 per rail. And then you've got Hyperloop, where the people knowledgeable about this say that ceiling speeds of 1,000 kilometers per hour or even more are possible with that technology. Now, going back to what's my problem for high-speed transport, high-speed land transport in Australia. If the challenge is to beat air travel, why would I settle for a technology which can never be faster than half the speed of air travel if I have alternatives that could be as fast as air travel, which would be Hyperloop? So what's your view on that? We had some kind of short pre-discussion where you said, yeah, we looked at Hyperloop previously. What can you recall from previous investigations why Hyperloop, maglev, and other technologies have been dismissed, or haven't they?
Well, I should tell you that I attend the International High-Speed Rail Association's conferences regularly. And during one of those visits, I actually was able to take a ride on the maglev the superconducting maglev line that is now under construction between Tokyo and Osaka. They've got a length of that line that is currently operational, and I was in a train, not wheels, steel wheels on rails, but on maglev, and that was traveling at 505 kilometers per hour, and it was smoother than the Shinkansen. So there is another technology there that I'm just going to make a wild guess and say you would have an easier time converting a high-speed rail line to a maglev line than you might think. In terms of your question on the maglev, on the Hyperloop, I was previously a technical director at AECOM, and AECOM actually ran with Elon Musk the what do they call it? The Hyperloop contest, where they invited companies from around the world to prepare a proposal for a Hyperloop system in their country. And since I had just finished the high-speed rail line, a group of young engineers at AECOM came to me and they said, why don't we submit a proposal to look at converting the high-speed rail line to Hyperloop? And with the consent of AECOM's management, we took the study apart and we used some other top quality engineers, such as Peter Prince, who was a transport planner that I work with at AECOM. And we looked at that. Now, the short answer is that there are huge technical challenges involving risk to passengers within those capsules that I think would be a big barrier for Hyperloop to become achievable. You're traveling in a vacuum tube at 1,000 kilometers per hour, and if there is any breach along that line, and let's just say you've got one going from Sydney to Canberra, so you've got, 300 kilometers or so. If there's any breach in that line, everybody within that tube becomes toast instantly. I
think I would disagree with that, and not because I'm a Hyperloop expert myself, but all these kinds of risk have been addressed by the organizations developing Hyperloop, building Hyperloop. It's not like I travel in a vacuum tube and therefore I can't breathe, I don't get air. That is nonsense, because the capsules where you travel in are obviously air conditioned and everything. Of course you can breathe. If you have a compromise of the tunnel, it doesn't mean everybody dies. I'm sorry. This is just not. I mean, you could argue everybody might die if somebody shoots a rocket at the very pod and the tunnel it's in. Yeah, but equally everybody dies on a high-speed train that's hit by a rocket as well. So I don't quite follow that argument, and I would reject that technologies are dismissed for arguments that are not real, that the proponents of those technologies can credibly dismantle.
Okay. I don't think you quite understood what I was saying. If there is a breach in one of those lines, and those lines are hundreds of kilometers long, unless there's some shielding or segmentation of it, the air rapidly escapes through that, and you have rapid decompression of the tube that the people are traveling in. My understanding at the time was that was referred to by the organizations that we were involved in as a catastrophic event. In other words, there would be immediate loss of life of anybody that was in proximity of that. So yes, you're right. Trains can be interrupted by all sorts of things, but there's an additional level of risk, I believe, and I don't think it's incidental. If they've solved that problem, that would be great. But I think the technical difficulties of that, when you've got an alternative that is proven right now, which is maglev, at 500 kilometers an hour, potentially 600 kilometers an hour, is something that would be more plausible. And that's getting pretty close to air travel time when you consider that you can go straight into the cities and you don't have the difficulties of traveling from airport to city center. So,
okay, cool.
But we put our proposal forward. It came in the top 10 in the world. They used the top 5 as test cases, and they were going to fund that. Musk was going to fund those top 5 for further investigation. That was probably, 8 or 9 years ago. I have yet to see any credible plan for passenger travel on a Hyperloop system anywhere in the world, in spite of the fact that the Abu Dhabi government, I think it was investigating that as a possibility. The only applications that I've heard of are freight. So if there is other stuff out there, I'm happy to look at it. But all I'm telling you is that the conclusion that was reached by myself and others was that technology was probably impractical for technical and risk reasons.
Okay, so let's. I mean, I would already be happy. I've never said, even though people misunderstand me left, right, and center, I have never said that Australia should build Hyperloop for Sydney to Melbourne. I never said that. What I did say though is that as part of a decent investigation of a business case, especially with a time horizon of 20, 30, 50 years in the future, you've got to look at evolutions of technology for what you want to build, land transport, that will be maybe even business as usual in the future. Because otherwise you just keep building some old technologies, and high-speed rail is old. It's 60 years old if you take the Shinkansen in Japan as the first one. So what I would want to see is some kind of investigation. It doesn't have to cost millions and millions of dollars. It doesn't have to produce thousands of pages of documentation, but some kind of rationalization is, we looked at high-speed rail, we looked at maglev, and we looked at Hyperloop, and here are the arguments why we decided to go for high-speed rail. I haven't seen that. I don't think that exists. And without those arguments, just saying, yeah, well, we do high-speed rail because we want to do high-speed rail. That's okay, but that gives you an idea of how decisions are being made in that whole space of high-speed land transport in Australia. What's the next decision that seems to have fallen off a tree? We start with Sydney to Newcastle. Why exactly? Where is the analysis which says we have looked at 3 options, 4 options, 5 options, just making sure we covered one from Victoria, which looks promising. We covered one from Queensland, which looks most promising. So just making sure that we're not focusing everything on Sydney and New South Wales. Whereas this investigation doesn't exist either. So what other decisions in that whole process are being made where people look at, why did they do that? And mind you, this is not just to satisfy me. I think a lot of these discussions around parochialism and so on would go away if there was a decent explanation for certain decisions. You may still disagree with the criteria for the argument, but you can no longer say, this is just because they like the people in Sydney better than the people in Melbourne, right?
Okay.
Would you agree in that there should be some investigation as part of a normal business case due process? That's my point of view.
I would agree with you, except that I would say that whatever options you looked at had to be within the realm of reasonably available technology within a certain time frame. So it's been eight or so years since myself and my team at ACOM proposed a Hyperloop system over the top of what would have been a Shinkansen or a high-speed rail system. Nothing has come to the surface within that period of time that suggests a Hyperloop is something that's viable within the foreseeable future. So if we were to take your argument to its logical conclusion, we would investigate rocket ships between cities. Elon Musk, vertically landing and taking off rocket ships. It's not within our time frame or our time horizon. So are we to wait another 20 or 30 years before we do some alternative technology? I think we need to get on. I would not disagree with you in terms of the maglev, because that's a proven technology. I've been on it. I've been on 2 different systems. They work. It's safe. It can get there. But I would not agree with you on Hyperloop, because that has yet to be shown to be a practical mode of passenger transport.
But just taking up the argument that you just said, how long would it take to write down, to formally document, we have dismissed Hyperloop technology because we believe at this point in time, in 2024, we consider this technology insufficiently mature based on the developments of that technology over the last, say, since our 2013 study? I would agree with you that the developments, the progress on Hyperloop over the last 11 years are not giving a lot of hope that this technology would be available in 5 years to build a line between Sydney and Newcastle. I do agree with you on that, absolutely. So let's just formally dismiss it, and I'm happy. And then we talk about maglev. Now, how do you and you may end up dismissing maglev as well. But again, you will have to come up with an argument. You will have to compare the 2 options. For those of the listeners who don't know, maglev was an officially offered alternative for Sydney to Canberra back in 1999. Right? So even here in Australia, for a concrete connection between 2 Australian cities, maglev was already offered as a realistic, deliverable alternative. So dismissing it face value without any explanation, to me, doesn't make sense. And I hope it doesn't make sense to you either. Yeah?
No, it doesn't. But I think you would be surprised to find that maybe it has been investigated. Because...
Maybe. Yeah.
I mean, I say that not because I've got any inside information, but until last June, I was working as what they call a subject matter expert within the Department of Transport. So from 2018 to 2023, I worked as a consultant within the New South Wales government, looking at value capture was the main thing, but as it applies to transport. And a couple of things I can say about that experience. I've never worked in government before, and I probably went in with a lot of the biases that a lot of people have. And I just would say that I was really pleasantly surprised with the quality of the people that I worked with in government. Yeah. Really good people, really smart people. Really dedicated people. Once you get up to the senior director level, and then you start getting political interference, and the quality seems to go down. But the other thing, so one of my findings, or one of my conclusions, is that really good people in government that get beat up a lot for all the wrong reasons. And that goes, for Graham Richardson, who was a great leader. And others, Alex Lowry. the second thing is that a lot goes on in government that never sees the light of day. And you would be surprised, I think, what governments get up to behind closed doors. And it would not be out of the question, in my view, that something has been looked at in terms of Hyperloop and maglev. Now, maglev, as you probably know, is being looked at in the United States between Washington and Baltimore, and also between Washington and New York. And the High Speed Rail Association, or I should say, it's probably the Central Japan Railway, is working with the U.S. authorities to look at introducing maglev on that line. So that would be very interesting. That would probably be mostly tunneled, but it's in the cards. The U.S. is now building its first high-speed rail line, or at first a couple, which is one between Los Angeles and San Francisco, and a second between the eastern suburbs or eastern side of Los Angeles and Las Vegas. So that project has been funded. So they are looking at it as the United States is on things in transportation. But I guess you'd be surprised what people are looking at or what government spends money on.
All right. Yeah. Well, my point was, it should be transparent. So we just I keep coming back to that. Transparency is a major thing in explaining to the public why a government wants to spend $200 billion and God knows how much it is by the time it actually gets implemented on something with the objective to achieve minimum journey times, where you say, oh, wait a minute, there's an alternative technology that runs 50% faster. What about that? Oh, well, we didn't look at that. Well, if you did look at it, then just bloody document it. Just document it so that critics or commonsensical people asking absolutely legitimate questions like myself just can shut up. We say, oh, they looked at it. Fantastic. They came up with reasonable arguments. I may not absolutely agree with all of those arguments. Like as you said, I violently disagreed with you about this Hyperloop potentially killing people. But if the arguments make sense, that's fine. Yeah. So, but the arguments do need to make sense. If somebody says, well, we went for rail because that way we can reuse some of the suburban railway tracks in Sydney and in Melbourne for the last mile of a high-speed line. I said, well, stop dreaming. You are delusional. It doesn't work like this. You will have a dedicated high-speed corridor point to point with some stops in between. But if you have a dedicated corridor anyway that doesn't have to interface with anything else, you could just as well use maglev, because for maglev you also would need a dedicated corridor simply by means of differences in technology. Yeah. So on the one hand, people talk about dedicated high-speed corridors. On the other hand, they dismiss maglev because it needs a dedicated corridor. Hello? Yeah. So I think transparency of the justification is necessary. And if that transparency is not visible, then you immediately, well, I at least immediately start asking questions, where else is the transparency missing? And we currently see it big time with that Sydney to Newcastle discussion, where somebody else says, oh, wait a minute, why not Sydney, Canberra? Why not something in Victoria? Why? Yeah. And this is basically just fuel on the fire of all these parochial discussions. It's always New South Wales that gets the cherries. But then you have, even within New South Wales, you've got the discussion north of Sydney versus south of Sydney. So it's not even parochial by state. It's parochial by frigging region. Right. So
I go back to the earlier discussion, which is, what is the first thing you do? You build a strategy. You build the East Coast settlement strategy, and that progressively, as you drill down into it, allows you to make the arguments for these types of decisions. So I agree with you 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk a moment about China, because it's been on my mind for quite a while. So the situation they had in China is they have a huge population, and a big part of this population lived in the so-called hinterland. And with the trend of urbanization, meaning more and more people moving into the cities, people tended to move into the big Chinese cities, which were all along the coast. Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and now Hong Kong. Sounds familiar? Well, our big cities are along the coast as well. So what China has done, though, is saying, well, we can't have like 500 million people from the hinterland all moving to Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. We just can't have that many people. We can't accommodate that many people. So what China did is to say, okay, well, we develop a belt of major cities in the hinterland, but far away from the coast, to enable urbanization for all the people from the hinterland without having to move to the coast. And one of the cities that actually were created in that sense is a city called Chongqing, which, to my latest information, has a population of 30 million. That's 30. So huge cities, and Chongqing isn't the only one. And then, of course, they needed a transport strategy. So they can't just have an isolated city in the middle of nowhere. They need to connect that city to the rest of China. So, and that's what they built the high-speed rail network for. So the high-speed rail network in China not only connects the cities along the coast, like Beijing, Shanghai, Shanghai to Guangzhou, it also goes to cities in the inland, like places like Xi'an, Wuhan, Chongqing, and many, many others. So, and that brings me back to Australia. This is what China has done, very successfully though. Now, back to Australia, what's the settlement plan here? How do we see a population growth in Australia from today, what we have today, whatever the number is, 25 million, something like that, maybe 24, to in the future, say 40? Where do we put 16 million people? And if somebody says, we built 3 more skyscrapers in Sydney, in Chatswood, and we call it infill, I'm sorry, that's not enough. Yeah. So this kind of settlement plan has to come here, and I agree with you very much on that one, and it should be a very, very early activity. And it may well be that the High-Speed Rail Authority said, well, we cannot completely discard our main mandate, which is the business case development for Sydney to Newcastle, but at the same time, we are big enough to put some resources aside to organize and arrange this kind of settlement strategy, which needs to be part of an overarching high-speed strategy in Australia. And I see you nodding, so I'm pretty sure we agree on that.
And to their credit, the High-Speed Rail Authority is doing that. I just think that the sequencing is odd.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, you need to please your boss, yeah?
Yeah. It goes back to your comment about transparency. If we were more transparent about how that decision was made about Sydney to Newcastle, we might be more inclined to accept it without pointing to other alternatives.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think transparency was another thing that's very, very easy to agree on. I think I had high hopes in the High-Speed Rail Authority when it was created. For one, I was hoping that they will bring more common sense in the whole discussion and not just saying, we need to build high speed because it works so well in Spain, or it works so well in Japan, or some other places which have completely different demographic, completely different geography and what have you than we have in Australia. And I also have that they are doing things transparently. So they really inform the public about what they're doing and not just publishing a 20-page executive summary of the business case, which leaves all the steps to get there unanswered, unresolved. We picked rail because that's what we decided. We picked Sydney to Newcastle because that's what we decided. And so, who are you to decide that? You represent the population, the public. Where has been the public consultation? Which should be the first line? Which should be the technology chosen? And so on and so forth. So, and the third thing really is to do the things early in the process, maybe not instead of the business case Sydney Newcastle, but at least in parallel, that is recommended by everyone who is knowledgeable about these things. You said we need a settlement plan. McNaughton said we need a settlement plan. And Andrew McNaughton, who, for those of you who don't know that in the listenership, he's coming from the UK. He's one of the acclaimed global top experts on high-speed railways. He's done a lot of work here in Australia already as a like remote guest worker. I think he even moved to Australia for a while, and now he's back in the UK. So if all of those experts, and these are just two examples, I'm pretty sure everybody in your association would agree with your position. We need a settlement plan. So I would agree with that as well, to just bring a third party in. And all of my other previous guests would agree with that as well. Anybody talking about high-speed rail says, well, yeah, first of all, you need to understand your problem. You need to understand your task. And in order to understand your task, which is to serve a growing Australian population, you need to understand what that means. Like, where does this growing Australian population will live in the future, which is your settlement plan. So these things all need to be done. And if they are done, then you can still argue about, well, yeah, but I would have chosen the sequence slightly. But it's not like they're building Sydney Newcastle and then in 10 years they start thinking about that settlement plan. That's not what it is. They do it now, which to me is a good sign. Yeah.
Well, I'll just reinforce what you've said, because you've referred to our website, which I would encourage people to have a look at, because the thing we say in the vision doesn't mention high-speed rail. High-speed rail is not mentioned in the vision plan or the vision strategy. It says
what does it mention?
We believe in that Australians living in urban areas and in regional areas should all have access to high-quality jobs, to affordable housing, to advanced education, to specialized medical services. And we can do that with today's technology by building a network of transport that is high speed and is fast or faster. So it's agnostic to the technology at one level in how you Australia's future development. So I go back to the tagline, high-speed rail is not just transportation, it's transformation. How do we transform our country for the next 50 to 100 years? And how do we make it more equitable? How do we spread the wealth of our country so that all citizens share in that wealth? Because right now it's not even.
Yes, I agree with that. But maybe that's a situation that's intentional. I mean, if I want to have access to all the highly paid jobs in Sydney and I don't want to commute of more than 30 minutes, that kind of constrains where I need to live. And if I say, well, I really like the landscape in the Southern Highlands and all the cows and the pastures and it's beautiful, well, there is a price to pay for that with regards to access to the high-paid jobs, right? So there are two aspects here. One is to make life better and the perks of the cities more accessible to people in regions. The other thing is an economic aspect to make high-speed economically worthwhile, which is value capture, right? So if you want to have any shot on getting your investment back on high speed, at least roughly, there are two things. One is the fare box, the money you get from passengers. And the second one is value capture, where you said, okay, well, I'm creating access to regions that previously didn't have access. And I can get money back from higher land taxes, from property development costs, and all this kind of stuff. However, what that normally does, if that happens, is it drives up the property prices. It drives up the cost of living. What I'm not quite sure is whether the people in the regions, in existing regions, really want that. So, for example, let's just say the connection, the strategic plan for the connection between Melbourne and Sydney is Wagga Wagga. So there will be a stop in Wagga Wagga. And the idea behind having a stop in Wagga Wagga is not just servicing the whatever 100,000 people or maybe 50,000, whatever many live there at the moment, but the idea of that is to develop Wagga Wagga into a regional center with 500,000 people. Boom. Do they want that? What does the mayor of Wagga Wagga, I mean, maybe he finds it fantastic because with 500,000 people, he would feel more important. But what about the people living there? What about the people living there said, well, I got a property for $50,000. In the future, if I go to Wagga Wagga, want to buy a property, it suddenly cost me $500,000. So I can't afford living in Wagga Wagga anymore. So I have to move what? Where? So I just handball this whole complex of topics over to you. How do you see this can develop that people in the regions are already accepting it by saying, okay, well, I do get benefits, but I also have disbenefits. Where is the balance? Where does it make sense?
Well, I'll start by using an example. When I went to one of the last high-speed rail conferences, we visited Nagasaki because Nagasaki was in the middle of constructing a high-speed rail station right in the middle of the city center. Now, you have to imagine Nagasaki is not a big city. It was completely destroyed during World War II, as you know. And the train, the high-speed rail line comes out of the side of a mountain that you can see within the city center, and then goes at elevation, in other words, on columns, right up to the port. And beneath it, they have actually had to reconfigure all the existing rail lines to put them on that same level. And you now have a new urban space underneath the high-speed rail line. And they took us to a meeting with some of the civic leaders after we'd taken a tour. And having lived in the United States and in Australia for long periods of time and knowing what some of the political opposition can be, one of the first questions I asked was, how did you deal with the opposition by local residents to this project? It's destroyed the entire corridor right up to the seafront. And there was a lot of murmuring, and people were turning from side to side and talking about it. And they said, we don't understand your question. And I said, well, there must have been a lot of opposition to all this. And one person finally got up and said, the complaints that we got are because they didn't have high-speed rail. And when were they going to get high-speed rail? Because after 50 years of looking at what happens to communities that have high-speed rail, the opposition completely melts away. So to get to the specifics, there are benefits that flow to those local communities, particularly those communities that might be in the resource sector or in the agricultural sector, where they have been losing population. Young people are moving to the cities. The economies of those communities are continuing to decline. And what high-speed rail will do, it doesn't mean that you've got a huge influx of people initially, yes, it will increase the property values, but you're touching on a issue of funding that is much wider than just high-speed rail, and I won't go there. I'll only say that the tax structure in Australia in particular is particularly pernicious because we promote all the inefficient taxes, such as stamp duty and negative gearing, that make it harder for people to follow to have affordable housing, and we don't use the ones that actually support that. So if we were to get rid of, and there's been studies by Prosper Australia, which is a tax reform organization. It's been around for 130 years. In all disclosure, I'm a director of that organization, and we have produced a report called Tax Shift, which looks at how you would be able to use value capture and other changes to the tax system to improve housing affordability and to make people's lives easier. Ross Garneau and Ken Henry have come out with similar recommendations, as has Alan Kohler, who produced a study called The Great Divide in the quarterly report. So I commend all those to reading. But what you would have to do is you would have to have mechanisms in place to control land use planning, to support local needs, and to also capture some of that value uplift. And there are mechanisms that can do that. I know because I've developed them. I've put them forward to the state government in New South Wales, and the New South Wales government is using them. So, for example, on the Western Sydney Airport line, there's about $180 million that's being generated from development around two of the stations, and that's being used to fund the project. Sydney Metro West, which is one of the metro lines that's under construction now, has applied it in one location, Piermont, and that's generating about $250 million. So there are benefits that flow out of these projects, which you correctly say, in many cases, and it's certainly been the case in New South Wales, the local people get absolutely screwed by this because they get none of the benefits. The uplift in value is captured by unintended beneficiaries through windfall gains, and those beneficiaries tend to be in the property industry. And so the problem that we've got is we're not applying the lessons that have been learned all over the world, in the UK and the United States and in Europe, about capturing some share of the value uplift, not the entire suite of benefits. But if you look at what the ACT does, the ACT captures 75% of the uplift in value from zoning changes, and that goes to the government to fund infrastructure and other services. That's the model. It exists. We use it. But what happens is that is staunchly opposed by special interests, generally in the property industry, who make windfall gains, and landowners who make windfall gains out of the investment in rezoning land and in investing in infrastructure that causes the uplift in land value to occur. So why should they benefit from this? Why shouldn't the communities that are around it have infrastructure funded by them? We have these studies by, it's now been Jackie Lambie and David Pocock took the reports from Prosper, and they had Treasury model what those changes to the tax code would be. And the changes would be introduce land value capture for public infrastructure projects, eliminate or change, swap over a period of time. It'd have to be a long time. Stamp duty, and put in its place a land tax, a much more efficient, and it's a tax you can't escape. If you owe it, you're going to have to pay it because it's attached to the land. What they found, what the initial study found, is that the tax system annually in Australia, if that was applied using the ACT as the model would generate $27 billion per year in additional tax revenue without reducing the revenue collected. It's simply because the taxes are more efficient and they produce the right sort of behaviors among taxpayers. So in these communities, what I would propose, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, I hope you don't mind, to answer the question you might be asking, what would you do? You'd make sure that these value capture mechanisms that capture the uplift from rezoning that can only be produced by better transport. It can't be produced by anything else because transport gives you the capacity for density. So if you capture that, you will be able to fund these stations. You would be able to fund a significant share of the line. And confidential studies that I looked at when I was working in government showed that, depending on how you did it, you could generate up to 30% of the cost of a fast rail line connecting Sydney with the South Coast, with Newcastle with the South Coast, by using these mechanisms. These are government studies. So you talk about lack of transparency. The government has looked at these mechanisms for years. They have studies that demonstrate the Sydney Metro West, $7 billion in private property value increase from that project. How much has been collected from it? How much of that? $250 million, a fraction. So these mechanisms can help reduce those legitimate concerns that people have in those communities. In Japan, what they do, they develop the Shin Yokohamas and the Shin Osakas. These are the areas outside the city center where they create new cities or new urban centers, and they put the high-speed rail station there. So there's ways to deal with these issues. One of the ways that I think we really need to look at, and our association, I hope, looks at, is what if you were to create an enterprise zone around these high-speed rail stations, like they do with economic development tax incentives for industrial areas? What if you were to take that walking distance around a high-speed rail station in Wagga Wagga and say, within this area here, we are going to apply land tax and no stamp duty. And what that would do, that would reduce by about $30,000 to $40,000 the cost of a new home in that area. And it would replace stamp duty with a land tax, which is much lower. And it's much more favorable to young families in those areas. So you would have a mechanism in place that would capture that uplift in value and apply it to the cost of the station and all of the supporting infrastructure, and it wouldn't be a burden on the state government, taxpayers, or the local communities.
From everything I heard over the last 2 hours, and thank you very much for taking so much time, I strongly think that there are people in Australia that should be part of a, let's call it think tank in lack of a better word, for high-speed rail, which goes much, much further than just the decision of what the first stage of the network should be and what kind of technology will be used. As your last statement said, it's going much wider. It may even lead to a much wider transformation, including the tax system in Australia, or at least aspects of the tax system in Australia. I strongly hope, I found it encouraging that you said you've spoken to Tim Parker already. I hope he will talk to you more often. And by you, I don't mean you in person, but you in your organization, your association. And I would wish you all the best to actually become part of the think tank, not just nominally as a potential pool of knowledgeable, high-speed knowledgeable people, but actually becoming real part of the discussion with the decision makers that really influences the policy in those areas. So thank you very much for your time. I hope, or I'm optimistic, that the listeners found it as informative as I found it. Maybe one acronym I wanted to explain: ACT for the non-Australians is the Australian Capital Territory. That's the piece of land where the nation's capital, Canberra, is on. But other than that, fantastic insights coming from you, Joe. Thank you very much for your time, and all the best for staying a voice that's being heard to in Australia for high-speed rail. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doc Frank. It's been a pleasure being part of it. And just as a reminder, we're going to have Andrew McNaughton at a conference in Sydney on the 25th of June. Follow our website for updates on that, and come for an afternoon, a late afternoon, and drinks to listen to the experts on how to do high-speed rail right in Australia. So thank you for your invitation to join your discussion.
Well, welcome. If I can ask one request for that event, just record it. Either make it a virtual event or a hybrid event, which is a mix of live and virtual, by just putting a camera up, or just record the whole thing and then put it online later. Because for me, I would definitely not fly 4,000 kilometers from Perth to Sydney to come to that event, as much as I would be interested in that. But it would certainly be a treat for many, many people in Australia if that thing would be available virtually online. So here's an idea for you to make the coverage even wider.
We're looking at either podcast or video recording, and unfortunately we don't have Hyperloop now because I know you'd be the first person to get on that thing and come over here if we did. So
I'm not. I say it again. I am not a proponent of Hyperloop, which many people misunderstand. I just want to have transparency in the decision making, and part of that would be an explanation, which may be very short, as you have already volunteered earlier in this talk, why alternative technologies to rail, such as Hyperloop and such as maglev that already exist in commercial service, would be dismissed. That's all I want. That's all I ever wanted.
I was pulling your leg.
Fair enough. Thanks very much, Joe. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dr. Frank. Bye.
The interoperability of digital signaling systems is not just an issue here in Australia, but also in other countries that have several railway systems interoperating with each other. Therefore, I have created the best and probably only training in the world on the topic of digital signaling interoperability. It includes my trademark SPA framework. If you want to know what that means, just have a listen to the training. I talk about digital signaling in Australia, which is transferable to other countries as well. I introduce the main technologies CBTC, ETCS, and also ATMS, which is a special bespoke Australian development. I talk about the hierarchy of interoperability controls, which is extremely helpful in investigating what can be done regarding interoperability. I talk about interoperability between different CBTC systems, interoperability between ETCS, which is not as easy as it may seem, and also interoperability between different signaling technologies. Podcast listeners are currently getting a special 10% discount if they sign up before the 30th of June 2024. And the link to sign up is docfranktraining.podia.com/interoperability. I say it again, it's docfranktraining.podia.com/interoperability. Hi, it's Doc Frank again. I hope you liked today's episode. I like to keep it as simple as possible, so I only have one single request for you. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. That's all I want, because that's a service that I'm providing to the industry, and I would like as many people as possible to listen to this podcast and learn something from it. So please share. And until next time, keep it simple and bye for now. Thank you for listening.